You just touched upon, the net zero ambitions, energy transition. Given all the research you've done right now, what do you think the roadmap looks like? Especially in renewables, I find it interesting to see at China just because they're doing things at a very big scale and they're also very pragmatic energy security. There's so many topics, involved in this, but how do you
Mm.
feel about the roadmap and where do you look to try to see what's the best or what is, how do we think the future will look? Because it's going to be a very difficult task, that's for sure.
That's the point. I think it's going to be it's very, very challenging. And it's challenging because I think first of all, because we are moving down the thermodynamic ladder. So we're going from a situation, if you look back at previous energy transitions, each time we were going from a fuel that was slightly less energy dense to one that was more energy dense or more convenient. So from wood to coal, from coal to oil, from oil to gas, we're moving kind of up this ladder where things are getting more efficient each time, and we're getting better turbines, and we're able to eke more power and more energy out of those inputs. Whereas, and obviously along the way, that we didn't realize at the very start of this, but then we kind of gradually realized it. We were also emitting carbon. But it's also worth just remembering that at each of those stages, it didn't look like it was an environmental catastrophe at the time. In fact, it looked like the new technology was going to save the world. And I think a really important thing to remember about this. So coal is obviously not a great fuel. It's not very popular right now for understandable reasons. It's very intensive. Um, and it's very dirty in other ways as well. However, when we first started using coal in this country, in the UK, in the kind of, 17th, 18th centuries, it was seen as the solution to an ecological catastrophe, which was that we were running out of trees. We were basically deforesting this country in order to fill the furnaces to make not just steel, but partly steel and well, iron mostly, iron, but also glass, beer. All of these things um, were consuming an enormous amount of wood to the extent that people were getting panicked about us running out of wood. We were literally cutting down our entire kind of forests. Um, Coal came along and coal basically solved that. It solved that, almost overnight. So the forests could eventually start to kind of rebuild in this country. Of course, it brought with it terrible catastrophe in the long run when it comes to carbon emissions, but it solved an ecological catastrophe at the time. When oil came along, people were worried about the extinction of sperm whales because people were fishing sperm whales to get the oil from those sperm whales to use for lighting, for lanterns. So oil, when it came along, averted another ecological catastrophe. People were worried that the streets in New York and London were getting so filled with horse manure that they thought the entire cities would be swamped by them. Well, then the car came along and it solved that catastrophe. So each step along the way, what seemed in hindsight like a terrible thing actually turned at the time seemed like it was really solving all of our problems and going up this ladder of thermodynamic kind of efficiency. Well, with net zero, we are going down that ladder. And we're going down that ladder and also at the same time having to try to reimagine a whole suite of different industrial processes which underlie the world that we live in today. And I think that's what is partly challenging about this. When you look back at history, when you look at the Industrial Revolution, and you'll see this in the book, you realize that this wasn't just a revolution of working out how to make steel better, although that was part of it. And if you look at um the story, the kind of cliched story of the Industrial Revolution, it's all about steel and how we made steel with coal and coking coal and about textiles and things like that. But at the same time, so many different things were happening. There were so many different advances. There were advances in chemicals. So we were learning how to make chemicals properly. A lot of that was quite carbon intensive. We learned how to make concrete properly. That was quite carbon intensive too. We learned how to refine metals. That was really carbon intensive at the same time. We were learning and making all of these amazing processes, aluminium, making aluminium, electrolysis, all of this was happening kind of at the same time over the course of about 200 years. And enormously challenging about net zero is we're having to compress a lot of those achievements into such a short space of time, relearning how to do all of this stuff without emitting carbon, or at the very least coming up with a really good way of capturing the carbon, while also kind of shifting down from a high energy density set of fuels to a low energy density set of fuels. And I think when you put all of that together, the scale of the challenge is utterly enormous. And what concerns me is that I don't think the politicians, when they signed up to these net zero pledges, were being honest. To be honest with you, I don't think they understood themselves the scale of that challenge, you know. But they weren't honest about it, and so it was painted as, you know, the costs weren't made very clear. And I think the difficulty of what we're going through right now is that people are starting to realize that there are costs attached, because it is now impacting them with their cars and everything else, and their heating and so on and so forth. And they're thinking, well, hang on, why are we having to pay more for this stuff? No one really told us about that. And you know, that this is the inherent problem, is that it is going to be expensive to get there. But I still think it's both necessary and a good thing. And I think part of the problem here is that there's opportunities, there's massive opportunity. And what I've just described about us needing to reimagine the entire industrial revolution in a carbon neutral way, that is one of the biggest industrial opportunities that the world has ever had. It's one of the biggest challenges we've ever had, but one of the biggest opportunities, because you need to think about everything. You need to think about a way of making silicon metal, so metallurgical silicon, first stage in making those silicon chips. Right now, there is no way of doing it without using coking coal in the furnaces, which, by the way, is an interesting thing to reflect on. When you're using your smartphone, you are using a fossil fuel product. When you're using the chip in that smartphone, it's fossil fuel product. But right now, there's no way of doing that without carbon emissions, without using coking coal. But people are working on that, and there are exciting things going on. So we are living through one of the most exciting periods, because an enormous industrial challenge has been set to the world, and people are coming up with smart ways of meeting that challenge. I feel too little is made of that. And I feel that it would be more palatable, I think, for people to understand, you know, the downsides, if they also understood there are big opportunities here. The opportunity isn't just that, you know, by the end of this century, we will have a cleaner world, which is more sustainable and which is less reliant on other people. It is that we will also develop a whole new suite of industries which are doing amazing things. Just to go back to your original question, and this is kind of a long-winded way of answering it, but I think part of the issue is that there is this big industrial opportunity. Right now, it's been taken by China. It is doing extraordinary stuff right now when it comes to its batteries, when it comes to solar panels. But a lot of that IP originally evolved in Europe. And Europe has allowed the industrialization of a lot of this green tech to happen elsewhere. And to some extent for the world, it's a great thing, because China's doing it at such scale that it's getting prices down, and there's enormous advances. Although you could say there are some downsides, because it's using a lot of coal to do it. But the aim is to create more of this technology, to make it cheaper. That's all a good thing. But what I think is a shame is that in Europe, you know, it could have been a good way of offsetting the downsides that people will inevitably see in the coming years. It's going to be more expensive. Energy is going to be more expensive for quite a while before it gets cheaper. It will get cheaper in the long run, but it's going to be more expensive in the short run, because we are moving from very cheap, quite prevalent sources of energy down to less energy dense sources of energy, and at the same time trying to create a massive industrial base of reimagined sectors while doing it. That's going to be expensive in the short to medium term. But to offset that, we could at least be kind of making more of the fact that this could be a really exciting industrial revolution to live through. And it feels right now like Europe's not quite, you know, seizing the opportunity there. And in fact, China and the US with the Inflation Reduction Act are doing it. So I think that's a bit of a shame.